March 7, 1945. The Rhine lay cold and swollen beneath a slate-gray sky as a small group of German soldiers crouched in the ruins of a shattered farmhouse, their rifles trained westward, their orders unchanged. Do not surrender. They had been told what awaited them if they fell into enemy hands. They had heard the stories whispered through foxholes and cellars. And yet, something they were about to see would fracture everything they believed. This was the final winter of the war in Europe, and Germany was bleeding from every border. The Red Army was already tearing through the east with unstoppable momentum, leveling cities and exacting vengeance for years of brutal occupation. In the west, Anglo-American forces had crossed the Rhine at last, the ancient river barrier finally broken. For the German soldiers still standing, surrender was no longer a question of honor. It was a question of survival. Yet many refused to lay down their arms. Years of propaganda had burned a single image into their minds. To surrender to the enemy, they were told, was to invite humiliation, starvation, or death, especially at the hands of the Americans, whom Nazi broadcasts portrayed as brutal, racially violent, and merciless. This belief did not come from nowhere. From the first days of the war, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had waged an information campaign as fierce as any battle. Newsreels, radio programs, and leaflets hammered home the idea that capture meant annihilation. The enemy, they insisted, did not respect German soldiers. They despised them. By 1945, many Wehrmacht units were shadows of their former selves. Veteran formations had been ground down on the Eastern Front or annihilated in Normandy. What remained were a mixture of exhausted regulars, teenage Volkssturm recruits, and older reservists recalled in desperation. Ammunition was scarce, fuel almost non-existent, and food increasingly hard to find. Still, orders were clear. Hold the line. Delay the enemy. Never surrender. The men hiding near the Rhine that March morning had already seen too much to believe in victory. They had watched Allied aircraft roam freely overhead, strafing roads and rail lines at will. They had marched through towns reduced to rubble, their civilian populations fleeing west or east in blind terror. They had fought rearguard actions knowing reinforcements would never come. Yet when the Americans advanced toward their position, white flags were nowhere to be seen. Instead, something unexpected happened. As U.S. infantry units from the Ninth Army pushed through the countryside, they followed a policy that had been quietly refined over years of fighting. Captured German soldiers were treated firmly, but humanely. They were disarmed, searched, and guarded, but they were also fed. On this particular stretch of road, American soldiers had established a temporary collection point for prisoners. It was nothing more than a muddy field bordered by hedgerows, guarded by tired men with M1 rifles. Yet from a distance, it looked nothing like the horror German soldiers had been warned about. The prisoners were sitting, not kneeling. They were smoking cigarettes. Some were eating chocolate. For the men still hiding in the farmhouse, the sight was almost impossible to process. One of them, a corporal in his early 20s, pressed his binoculars tighter to his face. He watched as an American soldier tossed a bar of chocolate to a captured German private. The prisoner laughed, actually laughed, and broke the bar in half to share with another man. No one was being beaten. No one was being dragged away. The corporal lowered the binocular slowly, his hands trembling. "That's not possible," someone muttered behind him. But it was. The Americans had learned early in the war that how they treated prisoners could shape the battlefield itself. A well-treated POW was not just a moral victory. He was proof that surrender was safe, and proof traveled faster than bullets. Across the Western Front, similar scenes were unfolding. In Normandy, captured Germans had been astonished to receive hot meals within hours of surrender. In France and Belgium, prisoners were allowed to write postcards home, short messages assuring families they were alive. Rumors spread through shattered units like wildfire. They give you bread. They give you cigarettes. They don't shoot you. For soldiers raised on years of fear-based indoctrination, these stories struck at the core of their resistance. Back at the farmhouse, the decision could no longer be avoided. A sergeant, gray-haired and limping from an old wound, spoke quietly. "We can't win this," he said, "but we don't have to die here." Silence followed. Then someone asked a question that had been unthinkable weeks earlier. What if it's true? They waited until dusk. As the American patrol moved closer, the German soldiers stepped out one by one. Rifles were placed gently on the ground. Hands were raised, palms open. No shots were fired. An American lieutenant approached cautiously, his voice firm but calm. "Stay where you are," he ordered. "You'll be all right." The words mattered more than he realized. Within minutes, the Germans were disarmed and escorted toward the collection point. Their fear did not vanish immediately. It lingered in clenched jaws and darting eyes. But nothing happened to confirm their worst expectations. Instead, they were given water, then food. One of them stared at the chocolate bar placed in his hand as if it were a relic from another world. He turned it over slowly, reading the English lettering he could barely understand. For months, sugar had been a memory. This moment marked something larger than a single surrender. By early 1945, American prisoner of war camps in Western Europe and the United States held hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Despite logistical strain, the U.S. military made a point of adhering, often exceeding the Geneva Convention. Meals were simple but sufficient, medical care was available, and physical abuse was rare. The contrast with conditions elsewhere was stark. German soldiers who surrendered to the Soviets often vanished into captivity for years. Many never returned. Those who survived spoke later of forced labor, hunger, and endless marches eastward. Word of this spread too. German troops began to differentiate between enemies. If capture was inevitable, they preferred the Americans. This knowledge shaped battlefield behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Entire units chose routes of retreat that angled west rather than east. Some commanders delayed surrender until they could make contact with U.S. forces instead of Soviet ones. Others, like the men at the farmhouse, waited for proof. Proof arrived in small, human moments. In one camp near Remagen, a German officer was stunned to see American guards listening to jazz on a portable radio. In another, POWs were allowed to play football using a ball improvised from rags. These were not acts of indulgence, they were acts of control. A fed prisoner was a compliant prisoner. A humanized enemy was less likely to resist. For the Germans, it was a psychological earthquake. Many had grown up under a regime that glorified suffering and sacrifice. Hardship was portrayed as virtue. Compassion was weakness. Now, their captors offered something radically different. One former infantryman later recalled his first night in American custody. "We slept on the ground," he said. "But no one kicked us awake. No one shouted. In the morning, they gave us coffee." Coffee, a luxury that had vanished from German rations years earlier. As more soldiers surrendered, resistance began to crumble faster than Allied planners had predicted. In some sectors, entire companies laid down their arms without a fight. White flags appeared in windows and on fence posts. Not because the Germans had suddenly embraced defeat, but because they had seen something that made survival seem possible. The psychological impact extended beyond the front lines. Letters sent home by POWs, though censored, carried unmistakable hints. "I am well," they wrote. "I have enough to eat. I am treated correctly." Families shared these fragments with neighbors. Rumors contradicted official broadcasts. Goebbels' ministry tried desperately to counter this narrative. Radio warnings claimed POWs were being deceived. Stories circulated of camps that were supposedly brutal and overcrowded. But credibility was already gone. By March and April of 1945, the Reich was collapsing from within. Cities were falling in rapid succession. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler remained in his bunker, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. On the ground, German soldiers made choices based on immediate reality, not ideology. In the Ruhr Pocket, over 300,000 German troops surrendered to American forces in a matter of days. Many marched into captivity carrying little more than their helmets. Some smiled, a sight unthinkable just months earlier. They had seen the truth. Inside the camps, life settled into a strange routine. Roll calls were held, work details assigned, meals served on schedule. There was boredom, frustration, and shame, but also relief. For men who had spent years under constant threat of death, captivity offered something unfamiliar: stability. One German sergeant described the sensation years later. "The war ended for me the moment I surrendered," he said. "I slept without fear for the first time since 1941. Not all experiences were identical. Conditions varied depending on location and resources. Temporary camps along the Rhine were overcrowded and exposed to the elements. Food shortages affected guards and prisoners alike. Yet even in these harsh settings, the fundamental difference remained. No systematic abuse. No executions. No deliberate starvation. The Americans, many of whom had lost friends in combat, carried out their duties with professionalism. Some showed kindness. Others kept their distance. But the rules held. As the war ended in May 1945, millions of German soldiers found themselves in Allied captivity. For those who had surrendered after seeing this, the simple proof of humane treatment, the decision had saved their lives. Years later, historians would debate the ethics and logistics of POW policy. They would analyze camp conditions, supply chains, and command decisions. But for the men on the ground, the truth was simpler. They had expected torture. They had expected revenge. Instead, they were handed chocolate. That small, ordinary object carried a message no propaganda could erase. The war for them was finally over. And in that moment, amid the ruins of a shattered continent, humanity had quietly asserted itself, not with a weapon, but with an open hand.